progress. And I use he, him pronouns. I'm with the Multnomah County cohort and Westminster's Presbyterian Church's core team. And honestly, I am here doing this work with Levin because honestly, when I see people come together and build power to make change in themselves and for the community, it's one of the reasons I stay in my faith tradition as a Christian. It reminds me of that sacredness that connects us to one another. And I am here to for two reasons now that I'm speaking. One, to reintroduce the sacred organizing spiral, which our organizing practices are rooted in. And two, root us in the particular practice we will focus on for the rest of our time together, which is called sacred encounter. Now, first, for those of you who are new or just coming in their first year of the cohort and are getting familiar with this term, sacred organizing, briefly, why the word organizing? Because we believe we can make a bigger impact when we organize people power together. And we commit to utilizing our power for life flourishing for all. And why the word sacred? We use the word sacred because we believe naming that deep reality of our connectedness with one another and that connected inner being, we believe that when we name that and we move toward that flourishing life, we don't just do something that where its means justify the ends, but if we truly believe that life is all sacred and that we are all sacred in life, we can move toward the world as it could be in a way that is embodied, holistic, and something that even could be beautiful. Now, let's talk about the sacred organizing spiral that we are using throughout the year. Listen, I am the type of person who likes to know where we're headed. I don't know about you. I tell my friends and family, do not plan a surprise party for me because it's not on my calendar and I will not enjoy it. Okay. So plan a party for me. And here's a brief overview of the sacred organizing spiral that we're going to go through this year. LaVeta, if you could put the slide up, that would be great. There are four main elements of sacred organizing and that we're going to go throughout our cohort year together, going roughly in quarters. We will start with sacred encounter, including tonight, which includes practices of one-to-ones and kinship with land to deepen relationships so that we can build power with and within. We will move toward, you'll see on the right side of the slide, sacred unveiling, briefly meaning practices like power mapping and research meetings to reveal how power is working in our systems and where there are possibilities for change. And then move towards sacred action, which is is what you might imagine organizing to be, right? Actions in the streets, letter campaigns, organizing around flashpoints. And then we have a sacred pause, a contribution to the organizing tradition that we believe in sacred organizing is essential. It emphasizes celebration, rest, and taking a minute to breathe. Some of you who have been involved in organizing may have heard these terms or practices before, but we have found in the years of doing this stuff together that the framing of the spiral and framing it around encounter, unveiling, action, and pause has helped orient us in a powerful way, right? The image of a spiral is nonlinear and ongoing. And in fact, as Jake shared at the kickoff gathering, if you were there, sometimes you don't always start with encounter, but an encounter can lead to action and you go bounce back to, oh, we need unveiling. Oh, we need to take a pause for a moment. And so, this image has helped ground us and orient us. And I'll acknowledge that there might be some of you where I said some words that, I'm not sure exactly what that meant or what's power mapping. And that's okay. We hope that through our time this year, we will grow together in getting more familiar with and embodying these practices, both in storytelling and with ourselves on the ground, with our spirits and our bodies. LaVeta, you can take down the slide and show my face again. I don't know, I went like this when I said show my face. Now, sacred encounter. That is what we're going to talk about for the rest of this evening. We define sacred encounter as listening that invites relationship. And through these relationships, build power for change. So it's listening, relationship. We will particularly focus on the practice of one-to-ones. And multiple organizing traditions have named the practice of one-to-ones as the part of the heart of what gets organizing going. At the most basic level, a one-to-one often looks kind of like it sounds. It's often two people, maybe sipping coffee or walking through a neighborhood, setting aside maybe 40 minutes or an hour to with the intentionality of uncovering motivations, passions, journeys in their life, and hidden prayers inside of them. Now, look, I'm going to give you a heads up right now. Are you ready? Sacred Encounter is going to have a lot of talking with people and sharing your stories with one another, breaking out into one-to-one relational time with folks, and maybe even getting in touch with your feelings and stuff like that. And I'm just going to name the quiet part out loud because this often happens in in organizing learnings when we start with Sacred Encounter, right? We spend this time teaching and practicing one-to-ones and story sharing, and people start saying, why are we starting with all these conversations and this relationship building and all that? I joined y'all to make a difference in the world. Where is the action? When are we going to get on the streets? And I want to be clear, I'm not that's a real legitimate question. You are here. I am here because you want to make a difference. You are here because there is probably something deep inside of you that is breaking your heart about your community or with someone dear to you, and you want to do something about it. And so what the tradition of sacred organizing is saying is that those one-to-ones where people come together and wonder together what is breaking each other's hearts and figuring out what you have in common with that, that is doing something. I mean, don't get me wrong. I definitely for a long time saw this one-to-one stuff as kind of counterintuitive and unnatural, right? And like what I mean, I asked that exact question that I saw in the chat. What's the objective of all this? And we'll get to that, right? I remember a pastor purposely doing a relational one-to-one with me. And he was trying to get to know me and know my story. That was his objective, right? When he sat, he told me that up front. He said, this is a relational meeting, and I want to know what drives you to want to make change in the world. And even then, I went to that meeting. I thought, well, does he really want to know my story, or does he just want to know, like, am I going to join a church committee with him or something, right? Like, what's actually underneath this? And every time I kept saying, oh, I have skills in X, Y, Z, he kept moving back to no, like, what's motivating you? Like, why did you decide to want to go to seminary in the first place? And when there are those curiosity and wondering questions he kept asking, I was uncomfortable at first. A one-to-one meeting where, and again, I'm going to be very clear right now and repeat over and over, a one-to-one meeting where you are doing an intentional conversation of wonder, where you particularly concentrate on uncovering each person's hidden prayer, their journey, their story, for the purpose of finding a common connection, right? And one-to-ones don't always seem natural what we're making the case for is that there's a human encounter that's somewhere in between, let's have drinks to talk about the Kardashians, and I need something from you and you owe me money. The one-to-one encounter is something in between there. Now, some of you might have your interests piqued by that description. Others are still struggling with, so what? What does this have to do with making impact as larger collective way in our communities? I'm going to address that so what for just a moment. I get the so what people. Before I was in Portland, where I got all touchy feely and nice and or whatever. I spent almost a decade in New York City, and in New York City, we're not wired to care about your hidden prayers or your deep emotions. You just want your pizza, your taxi, and did I mention money? And in New York City, that is where I learned community organizing with predominantly Black and brown working class communities. And I was thrust into meetings with the New York City Police Commissioner. And one of the first things I witnessed was an action where thousands of people flooded City Hall to demand millions of dollars for senior affordable housing and for fixing health issues in public housing buildings. And I was so amazed because that objective was achieved. And so in my organizing, one of the pastors who led that organizing, that pastor invited me to a one-to-one with him. He was this Black pastor, charismatic. When he got on the microphone, he seemed like a tough guy who's fought with mayors and all of that. And in the one-to-one meeting I had with him, I asked him about that public housing and a senior affordable housing campaign. What what made that happen? And I wanted to hear stories about him going toe to toe with politicians. I wanted to hear how he got all those crowds together. I wanted all that excitement, that being part of a big movement. And I remember I asked him that question, and he sat back, and then he leaned over for a second, and he says, "Well, it started with a one-to-one. He had a one-to-one with a grandmother at the church he pastored at. And she asked him, what keeps you going when, you lose heart?" He sat back and he's like, whoa. And the pastor, unexpectedly in that one-to-one with his grandmother, started talking about his divorce and his feelings of struggles and failure with that. But that what kept him going was being with folks, including in the church, who are trying to love one another. And the grandmother responded, she gets that too. She talked about struggles that she had with her family, her son, and that she does struggle to keep going another day. But then what came out is she said, what makes it even harder is that in addition to dealing with all those personal struggles, she has the headache of having to walk into her public building complex every day with mold growing on the side of the elevator there. And then the pastor kind of peeked his eyebrow just like that. What do you mean mold? And then the grandmother proceeded to talk about all the fixes that were needed in that public housing building and the other developments that have been ignored for years. And you know what? They both got angry at that moment together. And then they wondered out loud, who else is going through this? And then the pastor asked if that grandmother could invite other folks to have one-to-ones with the pastor, and also asked if she was willing to do some one-to-ones just to see what was going on. And then one-to-one turned into 3, and it's funny how these things multiply, which turned into 7, more and more. And more folks started saying, hey, we're all noticing this. And hey, we're all kind of really upset and heartbroken that this is happening. Hey, let's go to this house meeting, and on and on. And that bubbled and snowballed into thousands of people flooding City Hall, all from that one-to-one. One-to-ones are intentional conversations of wonder, where each person's hidden prayers can rise up and points of connections can form. All right, so what could this actually look like? Now, there are other expanded ways in which sacred encounters can happen between yourself, between your neighbor, and even with the land. We're going to focus on one-to-ones tonight. And while ultimately sacred encounter can never ultimately be limited to formulas and pockets, it's a little bit more of an art than a science. We do see a level of intentionality um, from we intentionally as part of the practice, and we'll be modeling that in a moment. But if you, LaVeta, if you could put up the slide, I just want to point out some ways to be intentional about this. Before I go to the bullet points, if nothing else, if you just need one thing to kind of grasp as you are thinking about how do I do a one-to-one, it's kind of moving from just it's basically questions of wonder. So not just getting stuck in sort of like, hey, what job do you do, or or things like that, but more like wondering questions about people's hidden prayers, about what deeply motivates them, particularly in if you're doing it in regard to a larger campaign, but just in general, just trying to unearth those. And so they are mutual, not prying, so discovery based, and they're not exactly task focused, but person focused. So again, that sacred, honoring that sacredness, that you really are trying, you are in the actual power is actually treating that person as a person with a full story to uncover. It's not just about inviting interest in a project, but inviting people into relationship. It's not based on project needs, but interest in the person and the story. The irony is like that you'll ultimately have more power in projects and campaigns building if you genuinely tap into trying to wonder and understand where someone is coming from. Next slide, please. And what it does then, because what you're doing is when you are genuinely trying to hear someone's story, hear someone's hidden prayer, the campaigns and projects and things that organize out of that don't just come from your one person's specific idea of what could happen, where they come from collective stories being woven together that bubble up. And that ultimately brings us out of isolation into community. And yes, I see in the chat, so more open-ended questions instead of yes or no's. Again, questions of wonder, where you wonder like, oh, in your story, how did you? Okay, so you took that job after this year overseas. I wonder why you did that, or and things of that nature. And so now I'm going to invite, so because this is one of those things where show rather than tell could be helpful here. I'm going to invite Des and LaVeta to introduce themselves and then and model a one-to-one in front of us.
Hi, all. I'm LaVeta Gilmore Jones, and I am the co-director with Levin Community, and I'm so glad to see all of you here this evening. And I do this work because of the people in my life and in my families who have benefited from having a place to call home. And it is so important to me that everyone has a place that feels and that they can call home. And Des.
Yeah, my name is Des Valdez. I use they, them pronouns. I am a sacred organizer with Storyline Community, and I've been doing some work with the Southeast Youth Collective this fall. And part of the reason why I do this work is I got to watch organizing work in my in one of the other churches that I work at. I also work at Prince of Life Lutheran, and it was just really incredible to watch things come together and watch my community move towards making a choice. So I've seen it work, and that has been such a gift to experience.
Well, Des, it's good to meet you. And for all of you here on Zoom, I'm telling you, this is our first time having a one-to-one conversation. So you're seeing this in the raw, okay? And we're not going to have time to have a 45-minute conversation. So just take what you see, and then we'll have a chance to talk about it in maybe about 7 minutes, okay? But Des, where do you live? Do you live in Clackamas County?
I live in Southeast Portland right now, in inner Southeast, but all of my work has taken place in Clackamas County, which is kind of interesting.
Oh, okay. So did you grow up in in Oregon?
No, I moved around quite a bit. So I grew up a little bit in Salem. My family is kind of from Eastern Washington, and so we moved like kind of in a triangle between Spokane and Salem, and we spent like a year in Meridian, Idaho, and then back to Spokane. So kind of all over the place, but I love the Pacific Northwest.
I'm kind of curious though. Why were you all moving so much?
It's so funny because people assume that I'm like a military kid or something, but like my dad just had a really, like, there were just things that would happen where like with the recession in '08, like my dad lost his job and so had to move to get that one, and then we've always kind of migrated back to Spokane because that's where family is. So it was all because of my dad's job, but he works in like automotive, like he's not like someone who has to move. That just kind of ended up being how life worked out.
Oh, okay. I get that. Because I stop and I think about it in my own story, how I've moved, but coming back home to family seems to be the thing that just keeps me grounded. Because pretty soon I'm going to be moving to Hillsboro, Oregon, and in Washington County. But in moving there, I'm moving in with my brother, and I'll be close to my daughter-in-law and to my 3 grandkids. So that makes me feel happy.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds so nice. Yeah, I keep my 3 younger siblings, or 4, I have 4, but 3 of them are all graduating back to back, and I'm like, one of them needs to move out to Portland. Like there's 3 of them, surely one of them will come to college, like in the area where I live.
Where do you think that sense of a family comes from? How where does that come? How does that resonate in your family structure?
My family is so well, I've literally had to like diagram my family out for people. It's extremely complicated because my family is all of my siblings and I are all adopted. And so a lot of that sense of family has, like, I've actually had to think a lot about like what family means to me, because who do I count as my siblings? Like, is it just the people I grew up with? Is it, foster siblings that we lived with for a year? Is it like my biological siblings? And so I've kind of come to just think that more family is good family, like, and to include, and like I have some really close friends that I've met in the Portland area that feel like family to me as well. And we do Thanksgivings together. So for me, like the most expansive view of family is the one that resonates the most.
So how does that inform what you're doing right now in terms of your work?
I think it informs like how because I work primarily with youth. That's been kind of something that I've done like since I was a youth, like in like middle school, I was helping out with kids younger than me. And I think that like expansive idea of like, who is my family and like, who is my community allows me to like, really like engage with the youth, I think in like a meaningful way. Like I have this, because they're kind of figuring out like what their sense of community is and what that means to them. And so I think because of that, there's like some interesting dynamics just in like how you relate to youth and like the conversations that come up and the ways that you can talk about things. Like I've also like I've worked with kids who have also had like similar like adoption stories, and so there's like some really cool resonance that I get to have with kids who like share that kind of struggle of what does it mean, what does family even mean, like what does that look like for me.
It's interesting when you were talking about being adopted, because when I was growing up, there was something in me that I don't know why, and I don't even know where it came from, but I said, you know, I think when I grow up, I'm going to adopt, make sure I adopt. And so when I got married, I told my husband, I said, we're going to adopt a child. And he says, okay, that's all good and well, but we'll have a kid first. And I said, that's not what's going to happen. And sure enough, that we ended up, our first child is adopted. And and that sense of knowing where you belong and having and feeling like you belong, I realized how important that was for him. And over the years, you know, he was adopted, and then we had a foster son who was grafted into the family, and then I had a goddaughter that was grafted into the family, you know. But that sense of belonging, it's so key, I think, to being able to move forward in the world. I don't know. It's just an observation I've made.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, and I know that was something we were naming. We just had a meeting with like the Southeast Youth Collective leaders, and we were naming how important like creating a sense of belonging was, and like how like creating space for kids to feel like they belong. And so I think that's so true. Like in our individual family units and the ways that we experience, like it's wonderful that you've been able to adopt as well. Like that's such a it takes like such a specific like kind of work to be an adoptive parent, but it's so powerful to be able to like give the kids like space and things that they need. And so yeah, like creating that sense of creating space for people to belong is just such an important part of the work, like both in our family and personal lives, but also like in like the larger community. Like that's so much of what people are looking for.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to have to stop here because Chris is going to engage those who've been listening in our conversation. But thank you. And now we will have to schedule a one-to-one conversation.
Yeah, this looks great.
Okay. Text me offline, okay?
Yeah, sure, thank you.
I love that. That was, yeah, because I just feel the genuine authenticity. Like, wait, I actually want to know more. So now we're gonna have a harvest with us all who got to kind of fishbowl and peek into this a brief one-to-one. First, I'm gonna ask you have the option of either chat or you know, you can unmute. And just what were observations you had about the one-to-one as to how that drew out power in that conversation? What are some observations you had about how that played out? Share either in the chat or you can unmute so we could hear human voice.
They found they had things in common.
They found things in common. Thank you. I see in the chat empathy. Conversación muy sincera. I loved how LaVeta shared as well. Equalized power openness, creating a safe space. Notice that they both shared parts of their own story rather than it being like a one-way interview. Mutual vulnerability was engaging to listen to, probing questions that tied back to both people's stories. LaVeta asked follow-up questions that took the conversation deeper. The conversation seemed to be natural and comfortable. And let me draw it very directly. What part of the conversation, what either questions did you hear or ways they talked that seemed intentional in terms of what sets a relational meeting apart from say, a meeting where you need to recruit someone to, you know, do something for you? What made it more of a one-to-one meeting? What were some of the key questions you heard? There was a lot of affirming from both. Someone said in the chat, it was a beautiful conversation. it seemed like LaVeta asked more questions like she was leading. Was that intentional? It wasn't extreme or dominating, just a bit more one-sided. That's a interesting observation. I mean, while we have a moment waiting for other observations, LaVeta, do you want to answer that directly?
Oftentimes, if we'd had a full 45 minutes, I would have not been asking as many questions. I think it would have felt a little more spacious, and we could have had pauses. But I have to say, when you're doing this on Zoom and you only have so many minutes, sometimes things kind of get squeezed in there.
Des, what about you? What were some things as you were doing it that you were intentional about as you were having the conversation?
Yeah, I was really intentional about trying to like connect it back to like myself on like a or like to answer the questions in a way that like invited more like conversation, and to be like, I'm naturally a person who's pretty open about my story, so that came naturally to me. But trying to offer a good glimpse of like who I am as a person in the time that we have, and to let that open up more. I'm really excited to have like commonalities around adoption. That's come up quite a few times when I've done one-to-ones, because there's a lot more people who have that experience than like even I realized a few years ago. So
Yeah, and let me just ask that directly too, to draw out more kind of observations in the chat, or if you want to say it out loud. What power did you see in terms of connections that, or let me ask it very basically, what possibilities do you see coming out of just this one-to-one that could happen because that conversation happened the way it did? What possibilities do you see? So I'm going to read in the chat, and feel free to bring more observations. Finding common ground, deep conversation. The question about what family meant to Des took the conversation deeper. Plus, Des was willing to be vulnerable and expansive in her response. I'll speak into that briefly. When you're in a one-to-one, especially because one-to-ones might be awkward for someone, and you kind of lean into it, and the invitation is to lean into the vulnerability a little bit, and because someone will be more vulnerable if you lead into it first, right? Present listening, they connected around the idea of belonging, and I think there's more opportunity to learn about that, what that means. Bonding, there was so much about moving and displacement relating to family needs and dynamics. Interesting to think about where that could go. What it looks like to co-create places of belonging. I get curious about the idea of grafting family and what kind of forms that takes in our world around us. I wonder too what world would come up around moments that don't have a sense of belonging. What is unique about the moments that do? Where do we see that in our shared work? Um, I also want to acknowledge that in one-to-ones, one of the things we like to highlight is just acknowledging power dynamics. And it's important in kind of one-to-ones to just name and be cognitive of power differentials across race, gender, privilege, and power. So just keep that in mind, like note your own privilege, or and that if you're talking to someone within differing dynamics. Shared power, it is empowering and no agenda beyond getting to listen and knowing each other. And I liked the way that Des's personal experience informs her work with the youth. Any other observations that folks want to lift up? Or any parts of the conversation that sort of stood out to you, and just naming that. I see Leslie raise her hand. Did you want to say something with out loud?
I was really wondering exactly what it means to lean into vulnerability.
Wow,
Now or later, it just.
that's a great question, right? It's one of those things. LaVeta or Des, you want to speak into that?
First thing I want to say is when you're having a one-to-one conversation with someone, you don't, this is number one, it's not a prying conversation. And so this is not a time when you are having to like develop your deepest, darkest secrets. This is not what that conversation is about. But it is a conversation where you're willing to explore together, where you're willing to build trust together. And so in that conversation, as you find places where you can make connections of trust, then it's a decision on your part. Is that something that I'm willing to move forward into? Am I willing to go just a little bit deeper to develop some trust between us?
I would also add, I think having like vulnerability for yourself and the things about your story that can like speak to doing some work like before you go into a one-to-one to really reflect on like the things about your own story that draw you to the work or might be points of connection, and then kind of allowing yourself to open up about places that are vulnerable to you, because that can really help. If there's vulnerability on one side, that can invite vulnerability on the other side as well.
Yes, thank you both. And again, I want to highlight that idea that one of the objectives of or goals, or I'm trying not to over objectify, but it is an intention of a one-to-one meeting that that trust can be built in a way that doesn't happen if you hand someone a survey or if you just assume they want this or that. And now we're going to